Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Scholars Hub at Home. My name is Joanne Hui, and I am the Alumni Engagement and Events Officer at the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change. Thank you so much for joining us for today's session titled Ecological Futures and Energy Infrastructure Across Continental North America. Today's webinar is a part of our Scholars Hub speaker series, which features timely and relevant educational lectures by academics and researchers from York. Today's Scholars Hub is in partnership with our Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change in celebration of Earth Day. I want to start off by acknowledging that the land that York's campuses are built on. As this event is virtual and we are all not gathered in the same space, I recognize the following land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you are currently on. If this is the case, please take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territories that you are on and the current treaty holders. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have longstanding relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses that are located and precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peacefully share and care for the Great Lakes region. I'm grateful for the opportunity to live and also work on Treaty 13 land. For more information about the traditional territories, please visit native-land.ca. So without further ado, let's get started. We would like to get to know a little bit about our audience that have joined us today with a quick poll before each lecture. So our question today is, how would you rate your current knowledge on today's topic? So a poll will pop up on your screen. Please enter your selections, and I'll give everybody a moment to respond. Right, let's see what our audience's feedback is. So we have some 19% are very high in terms of knowledge, somewhat informed, about 50%, and some are actually quite new to this topic. So very welcome, and thank you for joining us today. It's really helpful for us and our speakers to have an idea of who's in our audience and the knowledge that you each have about today's topic. So I do want to share that if you need help with the Zoom webinar, feel free to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to enter any questions. Our team on the back end is ready to help you. That same button can also be used for you to submit questions to our guest speaker to answer during the Q&A period following her presentation. For those that are joining in on Facebook Live, feel free to submit any questions or comments that you might have through the comment section for the video, and our team will send them our way. So to begin today's event, I would love to welcome Philip Kelly, who is the Associate Dean for Research, Graduate, and Global Affairs at the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change, to give us some updates from our faculty and to introduce our guest speaker, Anna Zalek. It's a pleasure to have you here with us today, Philip.
Thank you very much, Joanne, and welcome everybody. I'm joining you from the York campus from EUC. It's a beautiful sunny day outside. It's rather a quiet campus. It's our lull between exams and the summer term starting. But it's a beautiful day here, and I'm really glad that you're all able to join us. And happy Earth Day to everybody. Earth Day, Earth Week, Earth Month, I think it is now, and hopefully all year round as well. EUC, for those of you who don't know us, we are the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change. We were created in 2020 by the merger of the Faculty of Environmental Studies, the Department of Geography, and other scholars from across the York campus. And we were created really as a call to action to address some of the most pressing global challenges that face the world today around climate change, around biodiversity loss, intensifying urbanization, intensifying exploitation of the environment and of each other. And we are a faculty that's very small. We're the smallest at York, but really trying to make a disproportionate impact. And we've actually just released our very first impact report for the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change, where we try to spell out some of the stories around our impact on student experiences, the impact of our research, our contributions to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and what we're doing around equity and inclusion, both within our faculty and in the world around us. So if you're interested in learning more about EUC and what we're doing, we're actually launching that report on April the 26th, next week. And if you check our Instagram feed, you'll see there the link to that. Now, when we created EUC, I came from the Department of Geography. Our speaker today came from Environmental Studies, and there were a few people I was more excited about being a colleague with than Anna Zalek. But there you go, Anna. That's a public expression of admiration. Anna is an associate professor in environmental and urban change. She teaches in global environmental politics and critical development studies. She's also the chair of our faculty council, so very involved in our collegial governance. Her research examines and critiques the political ecology and political economy of industrial extraction, with a particular focus on the merging of corporate security and social welfare interventions in oil and gas, among oil and gas exporters. She's received many different research grants to work on topics related to the political economy of hydrocarbons, on industrial transparency, the contested regulation of extractive industries, both in oceans and on land, and within national jurisdictions and beyond national jurisdictions. Her current research centers on Canadian investment in the denationalization of the Mexican energy sector, and so that's what we'll hear about today, in part, and the financial risk in new extractive frontiers in global oceans and seabed contexts beyond national jurisdictions. She has a Bachelor of Arts degree in History and Political Science from the University of Alberta. Yes, she is an Albertan. She has a master's and a PhD from Cornell University in New York. And before joining York, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of California, Berkeley. So her presentation today, as I mentioned, draws on this recent work and examines disputes over Canadian pipelines delivering natural gas, much of it from the US fracking industry to the Mexican electricity sector. So she asks how these disputes are connected to continental and transnational ecological futures, and what their implications are for agrarian communities and indigenous territories in North America. So her title is Ecological Futures and Energy Infrastructure Across Continental North America. And I am delighted to welcome and introduce my colleague, Anna Zalek. Anna, over to you.
Thank you so much, Philip, and many thanks to Joanne and to Christina for organizing this and for the invitation to present today. So the material I'm going to cover was described by Philip, but I'm centering the presentation to some extent on the intersection between two different research projects. So one of them brings together the central project that I've been working on in the past 5 to 10 years, along with some work on seabed mining as well, but a major portion of my research has been on Canadian investment in the restructuring of the Mexican energy sector. And I'm also using some earlier work that I conducted on industrial scenarios and their role in shaping the energy mix and in shaping sort of future outcomes in oil and gas geopolitics. And that earlier work was particularly informed by Shell's Scenarios Division, which was founded by the late Pierre Wack in the 1970s and was seen as having actually predicted the oil shocks and having this sort of ability to foresee what was going to go on in the energy market. And I think that thinking about these scenarios, divisions and competing industrial scenarios is particularly important, because I think one of the sometimes lesser known features of the global oil and gas industry and market is just how varying that market is, and the fact that it is not a clearly regulated or planned system, that the market itself is very reactionary, and supply and demand is not easily predicted. And this is one of the reasons why there are oil futures markets, and why scenarios divisions are so salient in shaping the kinds of policy decisions that are taken by governments in determining what kind of energy supply should be supported, and the ways in which one might transition off of hydrocarbons. So I'm going to now share my screen. Sorry, where is, okay, here we go. So what we see in the title slide here is, in the backdrop, an image from the North American Cooperation on Energy Information Initiative, which is a trilateral initiative. And some of the maps that they provide showing the flow of oil, gas, and electricity between the US, Mexico, and Canada. And that information actually has not been updated on that particular website since 2017. And then in front of it, images of two social movements that have opposed gas pipelines in North America. And in this particular case, both are gas pipelines that are operated by TC Energy, formerly TransCanada Pipelines, the firm behind the now canceled Keystone XL pipeline. And so you see on one side, No al Gasoducto, an image from a broader protest in the area of the mountains of the states of Puebla and Hidalgo in Mexico against a particular TC Energy pipeline. And then on the other side, an image from one of the encampments opposed to the Coastal GasLink pipeline that the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs have said no to in British Columbia. And the presentation today will begin with talking a little bit about the competing notions of the future that are presented by both industry and critics of industry in deciding what will happen in the face of the kinds of conflicts you see between what is happening in the energy mix as projected by trilateral institutions that are modeling or that are describing oil and gas trade, and the social movements that are seeking from sort of a climate justice perspective and environmental justice perspective to intervene in the infrastructural plans of industry that are seen as locking in hydrocarbon dependency various decades into the future. So, why is this not advancing? Sorry, I'm having, okay, here we go. So, more images here of the contrast between the protests against particular energy and economic futures and the sorts of modeling that is done by, for instance, Shell Scenarios Division. So we see here a couple of images from recent Shell Scenarios publications, and then here are some images from the most recent one. So I'm having trouble advancing my slides here. Seems to be some sort of delay. My apologies. I don't know if it's because there's the why. Okay, let's go. So in the context of industry scenarios, we see the ways in which critical think tanks have actually sought to project futures in contrast to the kinds of futures that we'll shortly discuss of the industry. So here we see a few images from the International Institute of Sustainable Development, which arguably is a critical think tank based in Canada that has sought to reappropriate the term sustainability and development in an aspirational form to talk about what it would really mean to shape an energy sector that is not tied to the immediate profit-making interests of industry. And so you see on your bottom right a report that's now 30 years old, authored by Indigenous scholars and thinkers on 7th generation approaches to thinking through the future. And then a number of very recent reports through the ISD's Re-Energizing Canada project, where they're looking at a post-hydrocarbon future for the country. And two particular reports, and one of these is also co-authored by my colleague, Angela Carter, one on why carbon capture and storage is not a net zero solution for Canada's oil and gas sector. And of course, there's also analysis and critique of the whole concept of not net zero, which perhaps we'd have time for in Q&A, and the other about why Canadian liquefied natural gas is not the answer for the European Union's short-term energy needs in the context of the current war in Ukraine. Now we contrast these to the scenarios and the views offered by Shell Scenarios Division and TC Energy. So the most recent Shell scenarios that were just released in the past month offer two options, as Shell scenarios typically do, one seen as more likely to occur than the other. In this particular case, they're known as archipelagos and sky. But in both cases, and here I quote, these scenarios rely on using sinks, so carbon capture and storage, carbon offsets, to remove and store carbon dioxide, and also that the final temperature outcome and the ability to meet Paris commitments in both cases rests to a large extent on the world's success in deploying such sinks. And it should be noted that Shell is invested in the Quest carbon capture and storage project just outside of Edmonton, which is considered one of the larger international efforts at interning carbon in this way. Then we see a December post by the CEO and president of TC Energy, Francois Poirier, offering two simple ideas to solve the energy crisis. And his two simple ideas are as follows. First, he writes, sustainable energy policy must focus on addition rather than subtraction. And second, the second critical idea or simple idea that he offers is that we must stop labeling particular energy sources as good or bad and instead evaluate them on whether they are lower emitting than the energy sources they replace. And here, the particular energy source under discussion is that of natural gas, which is now TC Energy's major business, and they describe themselves as responsible for 25% of the North American continent's daily movement of natural gas supplies. And we see with this a pushback not only against the kinds of positions that are offered by the IISD, but also against Canada's commitment to end fossil fuel financing, particularly abroad, that it took at the Glasgow COP in 2021, a commitment that NGOs such as Above Ground in Ottawa have been working on in seeking to ensure that the Canadian government sustains this commitment. And so there's here a contest going on in terms of the kinds of futures that will be available for Canadian natural gas supply. Now, Shell has been careful since about 2015 to not return in earnest to developing new projects in the tar sands, given all of the environmental critique that was made of bitumen and tar sands in northern Alberta in the first decade and a half of the new millennium. But as mentioned, its other projects include both Quest carbon capture and storage, and also, and notably, it is the constructor of the LNG Canada project, which will receive on the coast of British Columbia natural gas piped through the Coastal GasLink pipeline, the pipeline that is contested and opposed by the Wet'suwet'en. So these dynamics then are the result of a set of relatively recent changes in the energy mix in the North American continent that, frankly, most people were not predicting at the turn of the millennium. And the major one is that after 2008, the US really changed its position in the energy sector, and that it became an energy superpower, a major exporter of energy as a result of the fracking boom. And the fracking boom, of course, itself was already in play, but was to some extent further impelled by the 2008 financial crisis, when a lot of people took funds out of speculative banking sectors and put them in commodities. And in that, the oil sector was one of the beneficiaries. So what we see here in these images is the increasing US pipeline exports to Mexico over the past 2 decades, and a major shift in Mexico going from being a net exporter of gas to the United States to becoming a net importer, something that really changed after the 2014 energy restructuring in Mexico, which opened up the Mexican energy sector to investment from private foreign firms for the first time since the 1938 expropriation of the US, primarily US and UK oil industry at that time. I don't have time right now to go into that in any depth, but happy to discuss that later. So as a result of this major shift in the energy mix, firms like TransCanada Pipelines, now TC Energy, which were seeing themselves being blocked in their projects to export bitumen or tar sands oil, moved more aggressively, specifically into the natural gas sector. And TC Energy is now a major importer of US natural gas into Mexico. And in this picture, Canada's Export Development Canada, the major export-import bank of the country, has offered a huge amount of financing to various TC Energy projects over the past 10 years. So here we see, this shift, the value of US energy exports continuing to grow, and the implications this has specifically for Mexican energy sovereignty. So for those who may have followed what happened in Mexico after the NAFTA agreement was signed in the 1990s, Mexico went from being a net exporter of corn to being a net importer of corn, which was seen as the compromising of Mexican food security and food sovereignty, in the interests then at that point of dependence and finding a market for US corn production. And a similar dynamic has occurred now specifically in hydrocarbons, in that Mexico's ability to fuel its own energy grid is now compromised under conditions that require it to not break existing contracts for energy imports. Now, all of this, as I mentioned, occurred through shifts in the strategies taken by firms such as TransCanada Pipelines, before it changed its name to TC Energy, thinking that they would find little environmental opposition in Mexico when compared to the Canadian context. But that changed. So the warmer welcome for business in Mexico shifted over the course of 2015-16, when the Regional Council for Land Defenders in the mountains of Sierra, of the Pueblan Mountains and the Hidalgo Mountains, pushed the then recently elected President López Obrador to change the route of a particularly contentious pipeline, the Tuxpan-Tula pipeline, that runs from the Gulf Coast of Mexico towards the Pacific coast. And that particular project has been stalled as a result of ongoing tensions, both over the pipeline route, so tensions that are the result of the protests against the pipeline itself by local residents, as well as disputes over the nature, the financial contracts that were part of negotiating TC Energy's entry into Mexico. And these particular disputes over the contracts and the role of the Mexican government in delivering particular profits at a certain date to TC Energy have been the subject of ongoing tensions over the last 5 or 6 years. So there were some immediately after López Obrador entered office in 2019. And even just in the last month, there's been a new set of sort of discussions about whether or not these energy disputes have been resolved. And at the same time that there was an announcement that there had been some resolution to some of the dynamics in these particular energy contracts, there was also the announcement of a new partnership on Indigenous peoples between Mexico and Canada. Now, these kinds of relationships between Canada and Mexico, nominally on Indigenous rights, are not new. But in this particular case, they occurred almost, very much in tandem with the discussions about the energy dispute, and also notably in tandem with the release of TC Energy's 2023 materials and 2022 annual reports. And in this, one of the things that TC Energy announces is that it had reached an agreement with the Mexican Federal Electricity Commission to complete the Tuxpan-Tula pipeline that had been stalled due to territorial disputes. They don't go into very much detail about those territorial disputes. But at the same time that this has been going on, it is noted by people resident in the sites that are being explored as possible rerouting locations for that pipeline, which are just neighboring communities to the previous route, that there is, that the Mexican Indigenous Affairs body has been going in and to negotiate with those communities on behalf of the Mexican Federal Electricity Commission. So basically what TC Energy has found through support of the Canadian government is a way in which the Mexican government will be responsible for negotiating the opening of access to pipelines that had previously been blocked due to protests by land defenders. Now, in this picture, there are many interests at play, and in an article that my colleague Aleida Hernandez Cervantes and I published a few years ago, we demonstrated how different parties within the Canadian state have been involved with negotiating the terms of Mexico and Canada's energy relationship. And we're also part of the broader set of discussions that led to the signing of the NAFTA 2.0 agreement, or the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, as it is sometimes known, or Canada-US-Mexico agreement. And so there were a set of different relationships and communication that we encountered through access to information and privacy discussions that demonstrated a long-standing set of dynamics connecting Canadian diplomats, Canadian representatives in foreign affairs branches to the Mexican energy sector going back various decades. The most recent example of this is that the former ambassador to Mexico, and this was brought to my attention by my colleague Caris Campuis, Pierre Alary in Mexico, actually took on a senior vice president position for Latin America in ATCO, which is another major construction firm that constructs pipelines and builds pipelines, after he left the position of ambassador in Mexico. So in this picture, then let's just turn quickly to the TC Energy Report of 2002. And if one looks there at this very bottom section that I have highlighted, they announced right here that with the Mexican Federal Electricity Commission, we are assessing the completion of the central section of the Tula pipeline, subject to a final investor decision. We are also working together to advance the completion of the west section. So here, these are particular elements of this pipeline that were blocked due to the protests of land defenders against these particular routes, both because of their impacts on water sources, as well as their impacts on traditional religious grounds in the Mexican setting. So, the dynamics that I showed, the image that I showed you of the sets of interests at play in shaping Canada's entry into the Mexican energy sector are part of a broader set of lobbying interests that have influenced decision-making in both Canada and the United States over the futures of hydrocarbon and over hydrocarbon regulation in the past 15 years. And so on the left, there's an image that comes out of an article by Nicholas Graham and William Carroll in 2019, showing the network of lobbying relations between particular Canadian and transnational firms operating in Canada and the Canadian state. And their work also built on some very important work that was done by the Polaris Institute, by Kaylee Doust, in 2012. And then on the right, a very recent article published by Eve Darian-Smith that shows the spending on climate lobbying by US oil and gas firms. And it has been demonstrated by various critical journalists the extent to which the oil and gas industry particularly has pushed for the expansion of natural gas infrastructure and liquefied natural gas export in the context of the energy crisis that has accompanied the current war in Ukraine and the embargo on Russia, even though considerable supplies are still being received from Russia to Europe. So, I want to close this here by just referring back to, where we started, which is sort of the tensions between the protest movements against the future of hydrocarbon infrastructure in the continent and the kinds of interests and future modeling offered by industry analysts, and to think a little bit about the ways in which these provide competing perspectives on what ecological futures would look like continentally. And, in the context of industrial scenarios, much is said within industrial scenarios to try and constrain the kinds of options that are available for transition. And so, certain kinds of options are explained as unrealistic or as not attainable within a global capitalist market. These are frequently models that depart from the basic tenets of capitalism. So no growth models or degrowth models that say that, in the context of a lot of critique, for instance, of critical minerals that would replace hydrocarbons, one has to also keep in mind that the best way to actually create a context of a lower ecological footprint is to seek solutions that require less inputs. And this, of course, requires restructuring the global economy away from one that produces massive amounts of waste towards one that produces basically on the basis of need. But this would not necessarily be one that is driven by immediate short-term profits for firms. And, in this picture, there's also another salient feature to keep in mind. And I'm going to close with this. This is the sort of geopolitical kind of picture that is behind all of these dynamics. And that is that in the current debates over the future of the energy mix globally, there is a major geopolitical dispute underway between the US and China. And this is something that is recognized very explicitly by Latin American structural economists, but gets much less, I think, less attention in the media in Canada, certainly, which is that China is very much leading in renewable energy options, in non-hydrocarbon energy options, and is in direct competition with the US fracking industry for the extension of energy infrastructure, particularly in the Americas, that will determine the kinds of energy futures that one will see across North and South America over the next 2 decades. And so here, a lot of the current geopolitical tensions that we also hear about between the US and China and Canada in that picture have as their backdrop this competition over whether or not the energy future will be based on one that draws on solar and wind, which also requires mining, or one that will be heavily dependent on natural gas. So thanks very much. And I'll end there.
It was wonderful. Thank you, Anna. It's so, well, disturbing, but also comforting that you're keeping such a close eye on the details of this sort of continental energy infrastructure and how it's developing, but also thinking about it with the larger questions of systemic restructuring and relationships to the global economy and global geopolitics as the context as well. I don't think we're going to be short of questions, but just to note for our attendees, you can enter your questions in the Q&A, and I will pull them out and present them to Anna. Whilst folks are tapping away, I'm actually really interested in the last point that you raised, Anna, around the competition between the geopolitical competition with China as a leader in renewable options, and the sort of the technology and the infrastructure behind wind and solar. Is that something that's is the Mexican state playing that side as well? I mean, is there significant involvement from Chinese manufacturers and Chinese state to expand that sector in Mexico, and to be a competitor for US energy exports in the way that it perhaps is happening elsewhere in Central and South America?
I think, at least to date, López Obrador is being pretty cautious about that, although, of course, there are Chinese contractors involved with some of the infrastructural development in the on the southern coast of Mexico. TC Energy has really moved in to try and absorb all of the alternatives. So, for instance, they very recently, in the last 2 months, TC Energy described themselves as the adopted child of the Mexican government. And they're involved with infrastructure projects of a number of different kinds, all over across in the south, the Gulf states, and in the Yucatan Peninsula. So There were certainly some Chinese interests in the lithium mining, which is not really developed in Mexico. And there's also a lot of Canadian interests there. And that has been also the subject of some dispute in Mexico, between Mexico and Canada recently, where Mexico said it was going to nationalize the development of lithium through the creation of a parastatal, which was also, I think, challenged under the CUSMA agreement. But I have not heard examples, although there might be others here who are aware of it, of López Obrador sort of employing the presence of China as a means of securing better terms. I wouldn't be surprised if there was some of that. But it's also a highly sensitive period right now in U.S.-Mexico-Canada relations. I think that, for all the critique there is of López Obrador, he's under considerable pressure to move forward the existing pipeline contracts.
Right. Thank you.
Natural gas very explicitly, and make natural gas the main source of electricity in Mexico,
right.
not.
I'm going to turn to one of our audience questions now. We know the questioner very well, Lena Brand-Correa, who knows a thing or two about all of this. She says, thank you, Anna. I was wondering if you could reflect on the advancement of discourses like degrowth in movements that oppose the expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure, as well as in political opposition.
Okay, thanks very much, Lena. I mean, Lena is definitely the specialist there, so I don't think I would be able to offer something as insightful as she might be able to offer. But I do think that, the broader debates around the future of energy markets tend to employ language around critical minerals, security, the need to ensure that there is sufficient material available to make a transition off of hydrocarbons possible. And in that, the option of an actually transformative shift in our economic relations that would produce less waste is given shorter shrift. And I think that that's why, the work that people like Lena and others are doing to demonstrate, how one might begin to move towards a just transition that also involves a much lower energy intensity and energy footprint is so important. I would say that, in Mexico, there is perhaps less immediate discussion of degrowth and even frankly, of non-hydrocarbon alternatives, because of the way the economy there has been so tied to a national petroleum sector for so long. And I think, making those debates part of standard policy discussion within parliaments is crucial. I don't know if that was very helpful, but anyway.
Great, thank you. Just to raise another issue, you talked about the partnership over Indigenous rights in Canada and Mexico, between Canada and Mexico.
Yes.
Can you say something about how the politics of Indigenous rights plays out differently in the two contexts? So we're somewhat familiar with, those of us here at least, with how that has played out around pipeline plans and so forth in the Canadian context. How does that look different in the Mexican context?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing is that Indigenous rights around extraction in Mexico were something that López Obrador, as an opposition politician, very much challenged, because Canadian firms and the Canadian state have been seen as complicit in the violation of Indigenous territorial rights, the right to free, prior, and informed consent in Mexico. Interestingly enough, also quite recently, López Obrador said, Canadian firms used to be bad, but now they're good. And this was more or less in the same period that the need to negotiate access specifically for these pipeline routes became part of the ways in which the conflicts over the pipeline contracts were proceeding. So where this varies is that well, for instance, in the context of the Puebla and Hidalgo communities, a number of the communities actually have to go and seek recognition as Indigenous communities in order to be able to uphold the rerouting of the Tuxpan-Tula pipeline, which they did succeed in getting in 2019. The problem is now the rerouting of that pipeline is going through a community that has not actually actively sought to describe itself as Indigenous, although a huge number of the the populace speaks an Indigenous language. So the dynamics are different in the sense that, a very significant portion of rural Mexico has a population that speaks an Indigenous language, but may not have sought formal recognition as Indigenous due to sort of the general ideology of the Mexican Revolution around mestizo identity, around the importance of Indigenous roots in the broader Mexican polity. But what is particularly disturbing, and what I didn't have time to get into today, is the way in which over the past 10 years, basically, the Canadian state has been offering workshops to the Mexican government, and this was prior to the entry of López Obrador as president. This was already in place, but we're offering workshops on Indigenous rights, Canada was, to Mexico, in the context of what were seen as major violations of Indigenous rights across Canada, and particularly in Western Canada, around contested pipeline projects, around contestation in the tar sands over the expansion of a number of Shell projects that were led by various First Nations, by the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation, by the Wet'suwet'en, by numerous First Nations across the country. So that Canada would somehow be then shopping around its relationships and the fact that it had not actually respected free, prior, and informed consent to Mexico, I think is fairly disturbing.
Yeah, thank you. We have one last time for one last question, I think, and fairly brief response, if possible, although it may not be possible. This is from Christina Shrestha-Hallock. Hi, Anna. Thank you for this informative presentation. I'm very interested in your last point. This is going back to the geopolitical tensions between the US and China regarding the futures of energy. From your perspective, how do you think this will play out in the long run, especially with the roles of other large oil producers such as Russia and Saudi Arabia? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't have, I can't predict how this will play out in the long run, but I would say that, we need to be cognizant when we're hearing sort of the kind of discourse right now that is fairly bipolar around the tensions related to human rights between the US and China and Canada, that one needs to think about the way in which the discourse of human rights is employed in different ways, right? So, I'm not acting as an apologist for any particular country and their human rights record, but, there are certain ways in which the employ of human rights operates as a means of trying to stall entry of particular countries into particular commercial relationships. So, I do think that people need to be cognizant of the fact that there are a lot of interests at play in North America in making natural gas the bridge and current fuel, as opposed to moving to non-hydrocarbon energy sources, which I'm not suggesting are themselves problem-free either. I mean, there's a lot of critique around the kinds of mineral inputs that are required for non-hydrocarbon sources. But to keep in mind that a major feature of the current dispute between Canada and the US and China has to do with these dynamics over the commercialization of energy.
Yeah. That's fascinating. Thank you. I think we have to wrap up, but thank you so much, Anna, for doing this today and sharing a peek into the richness of the work and the critique that you're developing around these issues. I am going to close it up now and hand it back to Joanne, who I think will finish up the event. So thanks again, Anna, very much indeed.
Thanks so much, Phil.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Philip, for this engaging Q&A session, and also Anna for sharing your work. Before we say goodbye to those that are in our audience, I just wanted to take this moment to thank you for taking the time to join us for today's session. We have one last poll question for you, and the question is, how would you rate your knowledge of today's topic following the discussion? It's popping up on your screen right now, and I'll give everyone a moment to respond. Right, so let's see. I just open my window for it. Okay, so we see that there has been a lot of improvement, much improved, 71% and 29%. So that's great. That's exactly what we'd like to hear. So thank you very much. So the next piece I want to share is our upcoming lectures that we have. So we have a lot of great lectures in store for you this spring. So please be sure to check out our website for more details. Our next session is going to be on Wednesday, May 3rd, same time, so 12 noon Eastern time. Join us for the session titled From the Workplace to the Kitchen, Understanding the Influence of Masculinity on Behavior with Luke Zhu. For more information about our Scholars Hub at Home series, as well as other virtual events offered by the Alumni Office, please visit our website at yorku.ca/alumni and friends. Feel free to share today's talk and all of our Scholars Hub at Home events with your friends and networks. The recording will be posted on the YorkU Alumni YouTube channel. Thank you all, and be well, and have a great weekend ahead.